Welcome back to an Electric Revolution. My guest this week is Gregory Nemet. He's a professor at the University of Wisconsin-Madison and the author of the fantastic book, How Solar Energy Got Cheap. Solar is on a remarkable trajectory and has now become an increasingly mainstream source of energy. Yet it took over 60 years for the world to install 1 terawatt of solar power capacity, and the potential of solar energy had been known about for over 100 years before that. Why did it take so long? In this interview, we trace solar's history from the earliest days in the 19th century to the first working solar cell in the early 1950s, to Germany's pivotal role supporting solar demand, and then finally China's complete dominance of the sector. Well, Greg, thank you so much for joining me today. I'm very excited to discuss your book. I heard there's a second edition coming out this year. What can we expect from the update?
Yeah, second edition. Well, the reason for doing a second edition is a lot has happened in the 7 years since the first edition. And as I dug into updating all the data, it became clear that one, things are moving forward on solar in multiple dimensions, but it also stimulates this question of what happens if it keeps going in that direction. And so that's been a big focus of the new book, is to understand what happens if the drivers of solar's rise continue for even a few more years. It makes a big difference.
Great. Well, I'd love to chat about that a bit later, but just first to your book, you tackle 3 really core questions. Number 1, how did solar become so cheap? Number 2, why did it take so long? And thirdly, how can solar serve as a model for other low carbon technologies? Just talking about the first one first, how did it become so cheap? I guess a lot of people would say China, but the book argues very strongly that a lot of countries had a role in making solar so cheap. I wonder if you could just distill your thesis.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I guess the answer to how it happened is really that no one country did it. Each country that led the technology frontier on solar never kept its lead for more than a few years, and each country built on the capabilities of the countries that had made contributions before it. And so it's really a relay race, and it's one that happened over 80 years. And so we have seen these dramatic changes in the last 5 or 10 years with China clearly at the helm. But there was a lot that happened before that created the situation where China was able to move into its position it's in today. So it's really the consequence of 80 years of innovation and incremental changes that we have now, solar that's becoming abundant and affordable.
And in terms of the second point, why it took so long, I think that is really so fascinating. And you talk about how it took 66 years since Edmund Becquerel first discovered the photoelectric effect to Albert Einstein receiving the Nobel Prize for explaining how solar energy actually worked. And then 49 years until Bell Labs came out with the first working silicon solar cell. So why did it take, in that initial period that I've just talked about, why did that take so long?
It's a really good question. One kind of basic idea is that its science was moving more slowly back then. There was an age of discovery for sure, but transmission of ideas, mobility of people, information and data were not the way they work today, where data flows instantly and is open and accessible to all. So people's experiments where they took a material like selenium and noticed that when you exposed it to light, you get a tiny electric charge coming out of it. That didn't lead to a company all of a sudden saying, let's make a solar cell and power the world. It really was in that inventor's head for a while and then spread to others more slowly. So I think it was just the pace of science back at that time, but also it wasn't super obvious that there would be a commercial market for something like a device, a material that could emit electricity when exposed to light. So things did go slowly, and it's a representative of solar throughout its past, from the early years and even to the later years as well.
But what's so interesting is you did have people like Charles Fritz, have a solar panel on your rooftop, and then another podcast guest I had talked about George Cove building a solar panel. And what she said was, at the time, the media was very positive about solar power at the time. And even there was a lot of talk about coal potentially running out. So there was awareness, right, of the potential.
Yeah, there was awareness. You're right. And, the big splash was in 1954 when Bell Labs came out with its announcement about the first efficient solar cell, which I think was about 4 or 5% efficient. And as you say, the New York Times did say that this could be the next revolution in energy that allows us to power the world from the sun. And I think there is something very direct and clear that people can observe the sun. They can feel the energy that comes from the sun on their bodies. Like, it's not a complicated description of why you could make electricity from the sun. But yeah, so we have these big events like that one, and then we get quiet periods for a while. And that is kind of representative of solar's. It's a series of false dawns and then goes backwards for a while, and then there's another reason why it comes back. So one question that comes up is what would happen if it had steady progress, say from 1954? That could be a different type of situation, but that's not how it worked. It was boom and bust over the next 70 years of up and downs for solar.
And is there a case looking back to the 1950s, the enthusiasm over nuclear, energy that was going to be too cheap to meter? Did that push solar out? Was there too much lobbying in terms of the nuclear lobby?
I think that's a valid description of what happened there. Yeah, I think that's probably right. Nuclear was getting its push, had military use at first, and kind of needed a civilian case to sustain its enthusiasm for it. And nuclear, it's a large-scale technology. It's very complex. There's a lot of safety involved. And so it needs lots and lots of funding, even to have a research program to continue. So it's not hard to see how some enthusiasm for nuclear would squeeze out other. Like, it's hard to do a little bit of nuclear power. You would have to spend a large portion of your R&D budget for energy on nuclear or not actually pursue nuclear. So nuclear did play a role. The other thing is that solar was very immature at that stage. It was small, and there was this idea that small means unserious, small means not up to the task of powering a civilization. And it was also an era of energy still being abundant. In the 1950s and through the 60s, there wasn't any concern that prices for energy would ever be a problem. They had been steadily going down since the commercialization of electricity in the early 20th century, and it really was only the shock of 1973 that changed that. So even though there was this big potential, there wasn't a near-term urgency because energy was abundant, and then we had alternatives that had a lot of political support, like nuclear power.
And the military obviously were the first users of solar power for satellites. And you had the space race with Russia. I think that's so interesting because people associate solar with hippies or the left wing. But actually it was the military and the space race, right, that created the first use cases.
Yeah, it's interesting how that really switched. So right, like that was Sputnik was 1957, and 1958 there was really the U.S. needed to follow Sputnik with its Vanguard satellite. And it was clear that the best option for powering the communications devices on that satellite was with solar. And solar had its day, and it worked really well, and it survived a lot longer than the alternatives, which would have been a small lead-acid battery that would have been also heavy to lift. So that was a big push for solar. But yeah, it was the defense establishment who is a natural kind of early adopter niche market for technologies. The same thing with semiconductors and early computers is defense had a really high willingness to pay, really high standards, only needed a few products, didn't need them to be really cheap. And that, solar was up to that task. So it was actually a really good opportunity for solar that the U.S. Navy decided to be the first commercial purchaser of a solar cell.
Yeah, I read they actually considered potentially putting nuclear reactors up in space, but obviously solar, its attributes, it was the only way to power satellites, and still is, right, to this day.
Yeah, it works really well. And you can, those solar cells are a little bit different than the ones we have on Earth because they have to deal with cosmic rays, but you can also engineer them to be super highly efficient because you're only using a small amount of them. And that's been an important niche market that lasted until the 1980s is when the Japanese really started to do what was called terrestrial solar power. So for a long time, solar space was really the main thing. So it was only later in the 1980s that we started to use them in terrestrial applications.
And just moving forward to the 1970s, you had the Arab oil embargo. You had President Nixon with his Project Independence speech talking about making the U.S. energy independent.
Yeah.
To me, the 1970s was this real decade where the U.S. and the West more broadly could have taken clean energy and really run with it. China at the time was completely closed and chaotic. So what did the US do during the 1970s in terms of solar?
Yeah, I mean, so that pledge that you mentioned about the U.S. importing no oil by 1980, it had a lot behind it. There was some of the most important legislation ever passed on energy, which was the corporate average fuel economy standards, which said that cars had to attain a certain miles per gallon, and that had to increase every year, and it ended up doubling over 10 years. That was important, but also the R&D program. And it was an R&D program that was commensurate with the Apollo program and the Manhattan Project that attained mission-oriented goals for the country. And the same was, let's do it for energy now. And so they spread lots of R&D money. The idea was that the private sector would spend a lot too. It went into the typical places. So the big ones were nuclear power and synthetic fuel. So trying to get a liquid equivalent to gasoline that would be derived from coal or natural gas. And those are billion-dollar programs. But solar was one of the programs that got funding as well. And it really kickstarted the U.S. to take a prime role in solar research. What was interesting is that because the money was large enough, it entrained lots of people from other parts of the economy and other countries, but especially it got people moving in from the electronics industry. And one of the consequences of that is that the leader of the solar program in the U.S., Paul Maycock, brought with him this idea of a learning curve, that as they were making calculators at Texas Instruments, and they realized and even could predict that costs would go down as you produce more and more devices. And he said it was a way to combine like the engineering with the marketing, and that the learning curve brought those two things together. And so he, in 1975, said, here's what we could do with solar. Let's do the same thing. We'll have to fund R&D, but also importantly, create a market for solar. The costs will come down, and eventually will meet the cost of the alternatives, which is making electricity from fossil fuels.
And he was quite accurate, right, in his forecasts in terms of what the learning curve could do.
Yeah, right. I mean, he kind of built this area under his learning curve that said this is the subsidies you'd need so that you don't need to have subsidies anymore. And he came up with a number that in today's dollars is about $100 billion to do that. And the country that tried to do that successfully was Germany, and they spent about little over $200 billion on their program. So he was definitely in the right order of magnitude of what it would take. But he said that in 1975, and Germany only did its plan starting around 2005. So we wasted a little bit of time in trying to accomplish that reality. But a lot was accomplished in the 1970s with the R&D program and starting to create some early purchasing of solar, which the government did.
And you did see the first commercial solar production, right? Companies like SolarX.
Yeah.
It's coming through. So by the end of the 70s, yeah, where did it stand?
Well, we were starting to have commercial entities, and some of them were parts of oil companies that wanted to diversify, seeing that there could be a future for alternative energy. That was the word at the time. One of the most intriguing policies at the time was they were called these block buys, and it was a form of what's called public procurement, where the government becomes the purchaser of early technologies. And the idea is you do a round of purchasing. You say, here's what we'll pay. We're going to buy X number of solar panels. And then there were criteria, like it had to have a minimum efficiency, and it had to demonstrate that it could be reliable and not degrade over time. And if you met those conditions, the government would buy solar panels from you. So it actually created an incentive for companies to start to produce solar, and to do it more than kind of artisanal style, where they were making very fancy panels for one satellite, for example. But start to do them in more mass production to get the costs down. And the other creative part about that policy was to have several rounds of block buys. So every year they were doing a purchase, and each round the costs would come down, what they would pay for the panels would come down, the efficiency criteria would go up, and the reliability would go up. So the idea was that you were getting better and better products for cheaper, and that you were getting the industry to mature and scale up and start to think about how to mass produce some of these products. So that was really an intriguing type of policy innovation that was important for the technology to progress and for the industry to mature.
Interesting. And you mentioned oil companies. So by the early 1980s, they bought a lot of the solar companies. I mean, looking back, were they generally serious, or was it kind of a tactic to buy them and squash them?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question. Unfortunately, the answer is probably overdetermined by other events. So we had two big events that happened in the early 80s that kind of took away the question about whether oil companies were really going to push alternative energy. One, there was a conservative change in the U.S. politics in 1980 election. So by 1981, the new government came in with budgets that slashed the solar program by 85% within a couple of years. So it really took away this idea that alternative energy was the future and that we were going to create these technologies that oil companies and others could commercialize and build on. So that was one change. The second change was in October 1985. Because of contentious discussions in OPEC, Saudi Arabia started overproducing oil intentionally to punish all the countries that were cheating on their oil cartel. And it crashed the price of oil. And oil stayed low for 20 years. And so this idea that started in 1973 that energy is now scarce, expensive, and we need alternatives was really that kind of 10 years of thinking was destroyed in that month of October 1985 when the oil price crashed and then stayed low for 20 years. So I think those two things were enough reason for oil companies to start to shut down their solar companies that they had bought and disinvest in them.
So how much can we lay the blame at Reagan and how much in terms of the oil price collapse?
Yeah, I mean, on one hand, solar's been a big success because now we're at 8% or so of global electricity and it just keeps on growing. But it does seem like a squandered opportunity that we didn't have solar much earlier. And, that was one of the forks in the road is the R&D program in the early 1980s. If that had been continued, I talked about there were 6 rounds of block buys that happened, but only 3 of them were funded. And so if the other last 3, which would have been much bigger and really gotten it close to commercialization, that really could have gotten the technology moving more quickly. So I think that was a policy change that happened. The oil price crash was a function of just how oil markets work. So I don't think that was kind of bad luck for alternative energy. But yeah.
But looking back, the US could have maintained its lead in solar, right? And that could have...
Yeah. I think the things that it could have done was continue to fund R&D at the level that it was doing in the late 1970s, which from a budgetary, I mean, we're talking about hundreds of millions of dollars. It's not anything significant. So that was really, that would have been easy to continue. But 2, I think the crucial thing would have been to start to support markets for solar, which it was starting to in the 1970s and 1980 budgets with these block buys and, maybe even move to different types of purchasing. That really would have gotten solar to move forward. So I think that would have really sped things up and moved things along. But there were other countries that had other capabilities and other different ways of supporting technology that eventually came into the mix that the U.S. really didn't have. And so in some sense, it was good that we had other countries jumping in and starting to fill the vacuum that the U.S. created.
And then it moved on to Japan. The industry moved to Japan, but then Germany, I think, is so interesting. So Germany in 2000 launched its Renewable Energy Sources Act, right? That led to the first feed-in tariff in the world for solar, and this had a seriously dramatic impact on the solar market and led Germany, which doesn't get a lot of sunshine, right, to be the center of the solar industry. I just wondered if you could talk a bit about that.
Yeah, big change in Germany. So in 1998, there's an election. The Green Party becomes part of the coalition, and that's the policy window that allows for solar policy to come to the front. And the Social Democrats and the Greens worked together for a few years, passed this law in 2000, as you said. And at first, it didn't support solar very strongly because it wasn't generous enough to solar. And also wind was always considered the more relevant technology. It was larger scale, it was closer to commercialization, and it was cheaper. So it was kind of a surprise that solar later became a player. And really it was in the revisions to that law in 2004 that created much stronger incentives for solar so that And with an interesting arrangement, this feed-in tariff that was borrowed from a California scheme and learned from Japan too, where the idea was if you put solar panels on your house, the German government will pay you for every kilowatt hour of electricity, and it'll pay you at double the retail rate, and it'll guarantee that rate for 20 years. And so it's just this unbelievably a strong creation of a market so that if you were a decision maker, a household or a company that wanted to sell solar to households, it became super obvious that you could make money very quickly. And clearly people were financing those systems at 2% because it was guaranteed to make money. And so the market in Germany increased by a factor of 4 in just 1 year from 2004 to 2005. So that policy really changed and created the first big market for solar. And that really led things to take off.
And German taxpayers, I think you said, spent around 200 billion to support the solar industry. They called this sort of Germany's gift to the world. I mean, looking back, I mean, was it worth it? Because there isn't a German solar industry today.
Part of the motivation was environmental, and climate change was behind a lot of this. So if you wanted to catalyze a clean energy revolution for the whole world that would make it economically feasible to reduce emissions and provide energy, this is probably the policy that did that more than anything else. So in a way, if that was your intention, it's been working better than planned. If your intention was to create a manufacturing industry, that worked well for about 4 years, where Germany was leading the world in producing solar panels. But pretty quickly, China recognized the opportunity, and entrepreneurs in China started selling panels to Germany that worked very well. And that led to the German market, or the German manufacturing contribution, shrinking considerably. But we still had large amounts of solar value added happening in Germany. So half the cost of an installation of solar is not the solar panels, but it's everything else. And most of that is labor, roofers, electricians, and that's all local, and that doesn't get globalized. So you still have that part happening in Germany. You have some now cost savings from these cheaper electricity rather than relying on fossil fuels. And so you don't have the manufacturing, but you did get a lot of other benefits. And so overall, it's a gift to the world refers to losing the manufacturing to everywhere else, but it also refers to the environmental benefits that have accrued to the rest of the world from the German policy. And as you say, the over $200 billion of investment that German ratepayers funded for solar.
And this is really the roots of China's dominance is in Germany. And one of the really interesting points of the book is how late China was to introduce its own feed-in tariff. So essentially, the demand in the German market supported the Chinese companies, right? And in a way, created the Chinese companies.
Yeah. And it was not created by central government diktat. It was really entrepreneurs that had been trained in the rest of the world and knew it was happening in other countries and figured out, okay, now's the time to produce in China. And they did, starting in 2000, and scaled up quickly, sold to the German market, and crucially couldn't get much funding from government in China. They really relied on basically teachers' retirements in the US was funding these Chinese companies. So you had Chinese companies, this is like 2004, 5, 6, were going public on the New York Stock Exchange. So that's a lot of pension funds in the US, sending that money to China. They use that money to buy equipment from Germany, from Austria, from Switzerland, from the US, bring that equipment back to China, make solar panels with those plants in which the equipment sits, and then sell those solar panels first to Germany, but then later to other markets as the subsidies started to change and arise elsewhere as well. So it really was this global connected flow of information and funding and equipment that made this all work. But it was not until the global financial crisis, 2009, that Chinese central government saw solar as a strategic industry and directly invested and supported those companies when subsidies were getting eliminated in places like Spain and the rest of the world was in a recession.
So that was a critical moment because China stepped in with a lot of state funding. I remember because I was in China at the time, banks like China Development Bank. So just at the moment when the German companies were losing access to credit, the Chinese state supported the Chinese companies. And that's the shift that then led to China's dominance, right?
Yeah. That really cemented things. You know, it's really this, as you say, this counter-cyclical investment. When the markets are not supporting the technology, that's when the government needs to step in. So you can imagine, going back to your question a few minutes ago about 1985 and oil prices crashing, that would have been the moment for the U.S. to create a market for solar. But China did it in 2010 and floated low-cost loans, seems like very low cost, on the order of $20 to $30 billion for a couple of years to keep these companies not only afloat, but like growing and scaling up and investing in automation and learning by doing and getting even bigger. And eventually, as you say, having their own feed-in tariff starting in 2011. And by 2013, China's not only the biggest producer of solar panels, but the biggest consumer of them. And they still are today by far the biggest consumer of solar panels.
Was it just credit that led to the German companies going bankrupt, or was it other factors? They didn't expand production, like companies like Q-Cells didn't expand production fast enough. There was also a bad polysilicon deal that they signed at fixed prices.
Yeah.
Were there multiple reasons?
Multiple reasons. Yeah, they weren't getting this easy funding that other places were getting. But on the other hand, they may not have been ambitious enough. And I think that's one German solar expert put it to me. He said, at this time, this is like 2007, 8, 9, when the shift happened, when the Germans were still thinking in megawatts of annual production, the Chinese were already thinking in gigawatts. And now we have Chinese companies that have like 60, 70 gigawatts a year of capacity. And so that was part of it too, was not growing fast enough. And then the other thing, which is kind of counterintuitive to a lot of things you might think, which is they over diversified. So there was this idea that, well, slicing up crystals of silicon seems very kind of mechanical and cost intensive, and there's a lot of wasted material. We eventually need to shift to something that looks more like the way we make thin film displays, where it's vapor deposition and we make thin films of silicon. And that's what Q-Cells and Japanese did as well. And as it turned out, we didn't need that advanced technology, and the downsides of those alternative technologies kind of stuck around, and the strengths of the old technology, which is just crystallized silicon, ended up having at least another 20 years of incremental cost reductions with more and more innovation and different ways of using silicon. So it was that partly that these companies diversified into too many directions, when the smart thing to do was just to take the old technology and completely focus on that and scale it up at levels that no one imagined were even possible to sell, and then do that effectively. And that's what the Chinese companies did.
But Germany also lost out twice in a way, because it provided the machines to China, I think around $30 billion worth of machines to make solar cells, right? And then China turned around and started building them themselves.
Yeah, I mean, it lost out in terms of being the leader of manufacturing solar on one hand, but on the other hand, it was selling billions of dollars worth of machines, and so that's not a bad business to be in. They were also sending consultants that had scaled up the Germany industry in the 2000s to China, and were, working to do it there too. So it was this transfer of knowledge that, it was a service that was being paid for. And so that's what Germany was exporting, not solar panels, but expertise and machines.
And in terms of China, so then China became dominant, but there were some bankruptcies, right? So Suntech, which you profile.
Yeah.
Yingli, I remember at the time, went bankrupt. So it's not as though China supported everyone.
No, but I think that is a way to think about China in solar, and probably in other places, other sectors too, is it's this combination of state support, but also intense competition within China. And I mean, we saw it with the early auto industry with China, when there were hundreds of car makers in China. And I think the government has played a pretty savvy game in terms of allowing that competition to happen, allowing failures to happen, and waiting till it's the right time to really devote resources to a small number of champions. And they look often to external validation, like money from the West going in, selling to the West. That's been traditional in solar. That was an important way to tell what companies were actually doing something that was worth extra support. So I think, yeah, we see the solar panels it's a brutal business. It's thin margin. It's super high throughput. And I mean, and so you would expect that companies will fail, especially when there's so much growth. So if you get the growth a little bit wrong, either going too slow or a little too fast, it's punishing. And so that's that's been the case. I mean, the two things I'd just add on that: one, we've never seen one dominant company in China for solar. We've had leaders, but when Japan was leading, Sharp had close to 40% of the market. And in the US, we had companies with 30% of the market. But in China, they barely ever get above 10%. No one company ever does that. And so it has this really healthy level of competition with scale. And that combination, I think, is something that China has somehow managed really well, despite the failures and the bankruptcies that do happen from time to time as well. And just the last thing on the low margin business, I had one person who worked in the Chinese solar industry say, this was probably like 2016, 2017. He was like, originally, like in 2000, 2003, we're hiring people. We looked for people that had been in the semiconductor industry, that knew how silicon worked and how to manage it and how to work with semiconductors. And he's like, in 2015, we wouldn't touch those people. We wanted people that had worked in the garment industry, making t-shirts and things like that, because that's the skill that we need for making solar. It's just super low margin, super high throughput, and just finding ways to optimize these production systems. And that's more like what solar is like in China now, albeit with a lot more automation than then.
And in terms of right now, obviously the Chinese solar industry, in a way, China never looked back, right? After 2015 onwards, it's the biggest producer in the world, around 80% of all the solar supply chain, and it's installing more solar than the rest of the world. But you see this year, the Chinese solar industry in crisis, right? Over $1 billion of losses and killing each other because of the competition. But I think one thing that's interesting to me now is reading a recent speech by Trina Solar talking about how innovation is now the priority for Chinese solar and calling on the Chinese government to protect IP, to protect patents. So how do you see that? That seems to be the new direction. Is China going to be the next, the big solar innovator?
Yeah, I mean, they've already done a lot of innovation on the production equipment and some innovation on how the cells are designed. And they're, incrementally adding things, but there are kind of more radical designs where you could start to really shift away from silicon and start either layering other materials like perovskites on top of silicon, or eventually not use silicon and really get the costs down as well. And so I think that's interesting that, there could be a move to more innovative cell designs in addition to the innovation in the production equipment, which they've really done a lot of. But there's also, I think, as you mentioned, this concern about IP that, from the history of solar, it's such a globally mobile industry. It's hard to believe that we're going to have 80% or more of production happening in China forever, because what's always happened is other countries bring something that the previous country that had this apparently dominant lead didn't have. And maybe it's some material, maybe it's knowing how something works, maybe it's access to markets, maybe it's some other way of using solar or integrating with batteries or something like that. And so I think that's something I would expect, that over time we start to have other countries playing a much bigger role in solar production. And it's already started to happen, partly with China trying to avoid tariffs that have been happening in Europe and North America by starting to shift some of their production to other places like in Malaysia and Vietnam, and then ship from there. So I would imagine the locus of solar manufacturing over time would drift away from solar, because these other countries, especially in the global south, are really starting to see the opportunities and like this idea of doing local production. And it's not that complicated once you get the machines and materials. So what Germany did in terms of transferring its technology and know-how to China in the 2000s, you could imagine happening to other places, and to some extent has already started to.
But I guess this is one of my questions about your book. The theory that you lay out is, many countries helped, and it was about knowledge sharing and skills sharing. But we're now in a fragmented world, much more fragmented world, right? And Trump is essentially, closing doors through tariffs, preventing Chinese companies from investing. Can we still have that process for other low carbon technologies?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I had this observation. I was interviewing government officials in Beijing in 2018, and this guy was like 3 hours late to dinner. And it was the day that Trump had imposed the first tariffs. It was on aluminum. And he said, we've been spending hours trying to figure out what we import from the US that we could retaliate on. And they eventually figured out it was soybeans. But that was an indication that this kind of peak era of globalization that I guess had been happening over 30 years, especially, that really was kind of solar, I think, epitomized, was changing to something different. So yeah, I think the free flow of knowledge is limited now. Some of the capital flows that happened probably wouldn't happen in the same way. Like teachers, pension funds in the US funding Chinese solar startups, that was happening 20 years ago and probably wouldn't happen today. But I do think one outcome of these developments that have happened over the past 6 or 7 years is that there is this value of autarky, of self-sufficiency, and it comes from the trade wars. It comes from energy insecurity from the Ukraine conflict that Europeans feel and that others are exposed to as well. And so this idea that you could create your own energy source is really appealing, especially for countries that don't have endowments of fossil fuels. And so something like solar and others fits into that. And then also you might want to have your own production, or at least some limited production. And so I think this kind of idea of the free flow of ideas and people and machines and money moving around that we had that fueled solar's early rise, maybe that's not the same now, but there's some pretty strong incentives to be self-sufficient now that could take things in a different direction. But I think the direction it takes it is more dispersed use of solar, more dispersed production of solar, so that other countries play a bigger role and it's not completely dominated by China.
But it seems like no one can really compete with Chinese companies. And even though they might shift production around the world, it's very hard to compete. And we've just seen in Germany this year, sort of Meyer Burger bankruptcy, a solar glass company going bankrupt this week. There's been polysilicon bankruptcies in Europe. It seems that no matter what we try and the amount of tariffs that have gone on, we can't compete with Chinese costs, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think that is fairly true. Although, before the most recent round of tariffs, where we had something like tariffs on the order of 25 to 50% in the U.S., and there was support for manufacturing in the U.S., we did start to have this in the last couple of years before the Trump administration, some growing polysilicon production and solar manufacturing in the U.S. And I think what was important is the idea wasn't that the U.S. would ever get to the scale of China's production or become an exporter of solar panels to the rest of the world. I think it's more that just needed to have a credible threat that if China ever said, we won't sell solar panels to the U.S. because you're our enemy or for whatever reason, that the U.S. had a response to say, well, we have our own industry. And if we have to, we'll scale it up. And we've done that before. And so I think just having enough of an industry around to have that credible threat makes a country less dependent on a dominant country like China. So even if you're not producing at the scale of China, you can offset some of the vulnerability that I think a lot of countries seem to feel. But it does take government support. And so without it, you do have things like bankruptcies, like you mentioned, because it's just such a high bar or a low cost that they need to compete with.
So Biden, I think, as you said, the policies were working, right? It had, the tax incentives, the tariffs, etc. It was working, but under Trump, he's obviously killed a lot of that. Do you think solar can still survive in the US in terms of production?
It's harder now because, as you say, the combination of some tariffs, like 25 to 50% in the Biden administration, plus strong support for manufacturing that came from the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law and the Inflation Reduction Act. There was a lot of factory growth of solar and other things like electric vehicles and battery manufacturing. But what's happened in the last 6 months is much higher tariffs, but erosion of the manufacturing support. And it seems clear to me that the erosion of the manufacturing support has been the dominant change, whether the tariff is 50% like it was under Biden or 2,500%, which it is against, I think, Cambodia for solar panels in Cambodia under Trump. That doesn't help manufacturing in the U.S. because those tariffs could change next week. They're so high that we're not going to be importing solar panels from Cambodia anyway. So it's a little harder it's a harder situation today than it was 6 months ago. And I think you kind of need that a limited protection with modest tariffs but strong manufacturing support to scale up, because there's such a high threshold for scale and for automation and optimization that China's worked out over 25 years that the US or another country would have to do on a much faster timescale to compete. So it needs support to do that.
And just another question about your book. You lay out very well, obviously, the theory of how solar got cheap, but how much is it a China story specific to China's political system, the ability to marshal capital, to have local governments supporting projects in a way that's not replicable by other countries?
I feel like that's probably true, because no other country did what China did in that period. And it got into solar at the right time. And when I say it, like a small number of entrepreneurs decided to try and were successful and were able to use the markets of Europe and Germany and the technology from the US and other attributes from Australia and Japan. So it was bringing together a lot of capabilities that had been developed elsewhere. And yeah, I do think there is something about China's growing confidence and ambition that was true in this period in the 2000s, where there was kind of no penalties for going too big. It was more of a concern about not growing fast enough. And the consequences of overcapacity just have never been as punishing as they would have been in Germany or in the US or Japan, where investors would never let companies expand that quickly, whereas in China that was rewarded. And because of the growth, even if you had overcapacity for a year or two, it would quickly get used up and you could move on to the next plant. So there's something about it. And I think the other thing that China had is this large domestic market that wasn't a big part of solar until 10 years into the Chinese solar industry. And they've really, it was good timing, because that's when, Chinese development is kind of really moving along. People need energy. And this idea of having a domestic market just it's so much bigger than anywhere else now. They've really done that well.
And China's growth now is just off the charts. And I wondered, final question, where you see solar going, because it took from 1954 until 2022 for the world to install a terawatt of solar power, but the second terawatt came just 2 years later, and the third, I think, will be later this year or early next. How much of the world's electricity do you think solar can provide, by the end of the decade or go forward?
I would say it looks like, just based on the driving factors here, like we continue to have cost reductions. We have complementary technologies like batteries that can help store solar electricity. Integrating grids with intermittent solar is getting better because we've got energy storage, we've got other renewables, we've got digitalization. There's new uses of solar, like really small scales, for example. It's got really strong social license, like people like solar in general. There seems to be this move to electrification away from liquid fuels that China's really leading. And so when you put all those together, it just seems like none of those things is likely to stop. In fact, that's kind of setting up the next round of growth for solar. So it seems reasonable that solar becomes the largest source of electricity for the world in the 2030s. So that's in the next 10 years, within the next 10 years. And then it starts to play a role not just for electricity, but for energy. So that includes transportation and industry and even agriculture, where solar can fuel processes to make fertilizers and things like that instead of natural gas. So it just seems like that's all set up for solar to really just take off. And I think the biggest, to me, maybe the biggest thing is not so much how to champion solar and to get it to grow. It's more like, how do we kind of create the enabling conditions so that countries around the world can take advantage of this resource that's cheap, that's clean, that's increasingly reliable, because it'll take things like finance, like how we do siting and permitting, grid integration, and then valuing the health and climate benefits of solar. So that's the recent look at the data that I did in this last revision of the book just makes it seem like it's likely to play a much bigger role than I would have thought 10 years ago.
Well, thanks so much, Greg. It's been fascinating to hear your thoughts. I'm a huge fan of your book, and I do recommend everyone buy the updated edition. I'll put a link in the show notes. Thanks so much for your time.
Thank you. Great talking to you about it.
Thank you for listening. Don't forget to subscribe to get all future episodes, and please leave a rating and review if you like the show. You can follow me on Substack at voltrush.substack.com to also receive my weekly newsletter. Thank you, and see you next time.